You're listening to Talking Threat Intelligence, a podcast dedicated to uncovering the new challenges of today's threat landscape. Each episode, we connect with some of the world's leading practitioners to share stories from the front lines of corporate security. And now, on to the show.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Robert Value, and joining me today is Naama Kates, writer, producer, and host of the very popular Incel podcast. Naama, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Naama, I just want to say before we jump in that I absolutely love the podcast that you've put together. Not a big fan, obviously, a lot of the elements of the Incel ideology, but I think you've really done a great job of understanding and humanizing this community without a lot of the sensationalism that I see so often in the rest of the media.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the sensationalism is one of the biggest problems in the world, frankly, these days with the 24-hour news cycle and just really what that leads to in terms of our society and the way we engage with other human beings. And, you know, you said I humanize them and they are human. So I'm happy to do that, I guess.
Yeah. And just while I was researching some stuff for the show, I kind of realized that through your podcast, it's the only place where I was actually able to listen to actual conversations with other members of this community other than the primary sources from the web itself. Whereas in a lot of other places, it's usually talking to other experts on the subject. But so I find that perspective from your show really fascinating. So why don't we just dive in then on the main topic and kind of relating to what we were saying there about the media? What is the biggest thing that you see the media getting wrong when it comes to the incel community?
The biggest one is that they're predisposed to violence in some way, or that the community itself somehow leads to violence in real life, recruits, grooms, endorses violence. None of these things are true. And in reality, if you look at the cases of quote unquote incel violence or whatever has been associated with incels, almost every single one of these starts to come apart when you really break it down. So, you know, that connection is the biggest problem.
All right. That's definitely the topic that I kind of want to explore later on in the episode. But just for maybe listeners that aren't familiar with the subject, probably start with just kind of the deep dive on the who, what, where, when, why of this subject. So why don't we just start right there? What is an incel?
Incel is a word that was invented, I guess, sometime in the 90s. It's a portmanteau, which stands for involuntary celibate. And an incel as they exist today, and what we're talking about when we refer to incels generally, is a community that meets online. It doesn't have a real life counterpart. So, you know, it takes place on forums and social media sort of platforms of men, sexless, relationship-less, mostly young men, mostly in North America and Europe, but kind of everywhere, diverse in many ways. And they are characterized by their forum posts, which are usually very sort of angry sounding and misogynistic and shocking and subversive to a lot of people who would see them from the outside. So that's what incels are. They have these beliefs and they talk about some sort of sexual politics, I guess you could say, or issues about romance and dating a lot. They get a lot of attention from the media, and I think they're kind of interesting for a number of reasons.
So when did this movement start exactly?
Like I said, the term was kind of first used in the 90s by a female student, but that's not really when as you said, the movement started. I would object to that word, to that term, because I don't consider them a movement. A movement is a group of individuals bound together by a common goal. I would say that incels don't have a goal at all. So I wouldn't call them that. But that word is used a lot and that term is used a lot. And I think that, you know, it's kind of a subtle difference, but an important one if we're talking about a group like this. But I would say the community started really about 10 years ago on Reddit. There were subreddits like the Red Pill and websites like PUA Hate about pickup artists. A lot of these things kind of grew out of 4chan and out of these actual movements that were happening in the aughts, in the late 2000s, that were kind of reactionary. I don't know if you want to call them like maybe slightly misogynistic groupings of people that just had beliefs that maybe went against the grain. And so, yeah, these communities started online, and they took that term and they began to talk about 10 years ago a lot of these issues that now have become maybe a little bit more mainstream today, or maybe not. I'm so much in an echo chamber that it's hard for me to say what actually is and what I'm just around all the time. But issues about people being biased about looks and height. And another thing that really pushed this forward is the use of social media, as I said, and also dating apps. I think dating apps have had a big impact on this community. But when it started out, it was a little bit less edgy than it is now. And it was a bit less kind of dogmatic. There were more outside voices. There wasn't as much of an association with politics. And then in 2014, there was an attack that media very much associated with this group, Incels. And that's when it started to become more of like a shocking edge posting, as they would say, community that was really a lot more angry and has since been associated with celebration of killers and violence. A lot of that's ironic, but that's when that started. So in the last 5 or 6 years, it has become more that way.
What exactly do members of the incel community kind of believe? Is there one cohesive ideology, or does it kind of vary depending on who you're talking to?
There is one. I don't really consider it a cohesive ideology, but there is the one. And of course, there are varying degrees to which they believe it. Some of them don't at all. There are plenty of incels that would call themselves incels that don't really participate in the communities or believe in this. But the ideology is called the black pill. It's a derivative of the red pill, which, like I said, came about in the late aughts or maybe around 2010 on Reddit. And that term is used a lot in the alt-right and other areas of the manosphere, which is what's called the male supremacist kind of corner of the web, men's rights activists and MGTOW, men going their own way, and others. So that's the red pill. And the term comes from the movie The Matrix, where the character Neo had the choice to take the blue pill and remain in blissful ignorance or like asleep, or to take the red pill and be awakened to the harsh truths of reality. So that's the red pill, supposedly these harsh truths of reality. Again, lots of evolutionary psychology stuff about human mating preferences and women and men, all of this stuff. But in the red pill, they believe there's a way to sort of game the system. So they know these things are true about human behavior, but you can kind of do certain things and act a certain way to make the best of it. The black pill, which is what incels coined and invented, takes that a step further, and it's just completely fatalistic. So a lot of the same sort of studies and opinions about human behavior and attitudes, but instead of offering like solutions or movements, as you might say, that the red pill does, the black pill is just completely cynical and hopeless. They believe that everyone's born with drawing some straw from the genetic lottery that dooms them to be miserable if they're incels, or to be successful and whatever, fruitful and multiply if they're chads, and that there's nothing they can do about it. They kind of just read this stuff over and over again and talk about it, give examples of it, find studies to confirm it, but there's no real mobilizing. There's no mobilizing at all to do anything, or even real belief that there's anything to be done.
So to make sure I have the ideology straight then, so blue pill is kind of you're oblivious perhaps to how the dating world works and how relationships work. Red pill is if you do the right things, you can figure out a way to I don't know, beat the system or have more success, might be a better way to explain it. And then black pill is if you're under 6 foot tall and not gorgeous, just give up now and kind of you have no hope. Would that be a fair, quick 101?
Yes, pretty much. Yeah.
Okay. One thing I've noticed in a lot of the articles that I've read and through my research and going back to the media sources is this ideological link between, say, the alt-right and a lot of racist and kind of white supremacist idea. Would you say that's a fair characterization at all?
No, it's not. There is crossover with language, the terms. Obviously, they're both subversive. They're both anti-feminist in a lot of ways. So there is that. There are some things that cross over, just issues with modern society, modernity, feminism, progressivism. But the reasoning behind them are different. The reason that people in the alt-right, at least that they say they believe these things, are different from incels. I think that them both being subversive groups, there's a bit of an attraction from one to the other. And maybe the people within them have similarities. I think that they probably do to some extent, but there's no racism with incels. They use racist language a lot of the time, again, just to be shocking, but they really believe that society is racist and they're calling society out on its hypocrisy for that. A lot of incels are not white and think that there is a lot of racism against men of color, so to speak. When you look at the countries where they're from, for instance, on their forums, there are actually a lower percentage would be white than you'd expect just by chance from, being from those places. So that's not true. And then I think another thing that's the main, incels aren't really political at all. And I think that one of the main differences with the alt-right or far-right movements or the racist groups is they're all about this pride in their identity. And they would consider themselves usually, I think, very manly. That's usually a big element of it. Incels, no pride. They don't want to be incels. They don't take any pride in being incels. They have nothing but shame over it. They don't consider themselves men or tough men. They don't tell anyone in their IRL in real life that they're incels. So that's a big difference, I would say.
So perhaps just like a cursory glance at the language might hint that there's some connection there, but not exactly once you start kind of discussing and really diving into the weeds.
Yeah. In terms of the demographics and mostly the ideologies, and the fact that one of them, I would say, is a movement. And the movement.
One point that you raised there, too, was just kind of the racial breakdown of the incel community. What other stats could you share with who makes up this group?
Actually, their political beliefs have been looked at recently in a study by William Costello. And it's something like a little bit more than a third are left-leaning. A little bit less than a third are right and nothing. So that was a surprising one for a lot of people.
That just sounds like a normal split of the general population, which is quite surprising than what I would have expected.
Yeah. The ages tend to kind of center around the young 20s, the majority of them. There's a belief that a lot of them are these guys that live in their mother's basements and don't do anything. I would say that, and they call that condition to be NEET, N-E-E-T, not in employment, education, or training. The amount that are NEET is a little bit higher for incels than it is for non-incels, but not by much. A lot of them are in school. A lot of the ones that are older do work. And the reason it's higher is probably because there are a lot of developmental disorders, some learning disabilities and mental health issues. Something like 20% of them are formally diagnosed to be on the autism spectrum, which is staggeringly high compared to the 1% of the general population. And then another 15 or 20% believe that they are. Upwards of 70 or 80% have depression, have anxiety. They report really high instances of bullying. As far as the kind of income breakdown, that's also kind of representative of the general population, with most being in the middle, and then a pretty small amount reporting themselves as being upper middle class, and a little bit bigger than that being working class or lower middle class. This was there. Yeah, in terms of the countries that they're from, it's a pretty also expectable spread. How many are from kind of Northern and Western Europe? North America are the majority. But again, this is given that the websites are in English and countries where people would be more likely to have a lot of access to the internet. So the demographics are, I think, in some ways exactly what you'd expect if you were coming to it objectively, not what you'd expect if you were basing it on the media stereotype.
Well, I think, everyone that probably approaches this subject is thinking young guy in the basement, dark basement or something like that. Whereas, the picture that you've just provided is completely different from what I think most people would expect at first glance. How did we get this data?
Actually, their biggest website, incels.co and incels.is. One of the things I found really interesting about it was that they actually did polls of their own community every 6 months when I first started looking at it. And I thought that was great because the polls were really well done. They had a lot of great questions and they got tons of responses, like, an academic's dream to get this big of a sample size. And people were honest on it because well, there's just this idea of the rule of large numbers, that if you have enough people, that kind of accounts for deception. But it was also, they trusted the community, and it was the administrator of the site that wrote the surveys and gave them out. So I thought that was really interesting. I talked to the owners and admins of that site a lot on my show. And so then a little bit later down the road, they were willing to participate in a study that was actually done formally by a group of academics. And another good one has been done since. So yeah, from polls that I think are pretty solid.
Let's move on now to the discussion about the security threat that the incel community allegedly represents in a lot of the sources that we've talked about. Could you provide kind of a brief history of the attacks that are linked to the violent fringe of this community and how those individuals are kind of linked within the incel community as a whole?
So the first one is, as I mentioned, is the Isla Vista attack in 2014. Elliot Rogers, the name of the shooter, he was 23, I believe. And he basically stabbed a couple people, roommates, and then shot a bunch of people in his college area, not on campus, but in a popular sort of street where a lot of students would hang out and party. He left a long manifesto, about 150 pages, some YouTube videos. He was a very dandy-ish Oscar Wilde-like figure, I guess you could say. Patrick Bateman, like a Bret Easton Ellis character. He was very wealthy. So he was this intriguing, sort of compelling figure. And he never called himself an incel, but he certainly represents a lot of what has come to be associated with incels and the language to, he called himself the supreme gentleman and all these things. But yeah, he never called himself an incel. It was the media that started banding about that term. He had gone to the sort of proto-incel websites and actually not liked them very much. And then a year later, Chris Harper Mercer, also a shooting at a college campus. This was an individual that did leave a manifesto, though I have read it. It's available on this one really great site, but most people haven't. It's not widely available. He was a bit older. He had a military background, as a lot of them do. And he also shot up that this was actually his campus in Oregon. And he did write about lamenting not having women attracted to him and not having a girlfriend. But in my opinion, I don't think, whatever, I won't get into that. He's not really talked about as much because he didn't leave as much of a footprint, and I am a person that believes that notoriety of the killers, the way we report on them, absolutely creates copycats. And so he's in point right here. This is a similar attack, but he didn't leave this basically like a almost cartoonish villanesque figure for people to really get into. So people don't talk about him. So there's a lot of ironic reference made to some of these killers, mostly Elliot Rodger, who I just mentioned, and Alec Manassian, whom I'm about to mention. These are the two that get talked about the most. After an incident, sometimes others are mentioned. Incels know this ticks people off. They know that journalists are going to write about it. They say things like, go ER, go Elliot Rodger, in reference to go commit a school shooting. They never mean it. They throw it into language like, oh, that makes me want to go ER, go ER. It's used completely ironically. I know it's tasteless, but it's not what people think that it is. Then there were a few other attacks that have been associated with incels, I think very loosely and often wrongly. The next big one is Alec Manassian, the vehicle ramming attack in Toronto. This was in 2018, and a Canadian young man who also had a similar history to a lot of them, kind of a lot of disappointments in school, very isolated, an stint with the military that didn't go very well. And he rented a van and just drove it down a city street in Toronto into a crowd of people, ended up killing 10. And he wanted to commit suicide by cop, I think had every intention to do that. But the cop on the scene didn't believe him when he said he was armed, and he ended up being arrested. He went to trial just a year ago. His trial ended. And before that, too, when his interrogations came out, it became clear to me, I think, and to some other people, that what he said that associated him with incels was a little bit weird. He told the cop that he had planned to commit this attack because he was an incel. He gave these stories right out of Elliot Rodger's manifesto. And he said that he had communicated with Elliot Rodger and Chris Harper Mercer and gave platforms, which this would have been impossible to be true. So it was like, okay, what's going on with this? He might believe it himself, but he's either very deluded or he's exaggerating. Either way, it's not true. And throughout the course of the trial, it came out that he had a fixation with mass shooters since he was 10. You know, he loved the Columbine kids, all these others, even some serial killers. And the incel angle just didn't really seem very solid. And in her ruling, the judge on the case, very wisely, I think, said that she wasn't even going to consider the incel angle in her sentence because she believed that Manassian wanted notoriety and he was using that as a way to gain himself more notoriety. And I think that's true. You know, when someone's had a fixation with mass shooters since they're 10 before they ever heard of being an incel, to say that this is like an incel killing, I think it's difficult to do that. But he's one that's talked about a lot because it was a strange attack, very lethal, and he survived.
Right. It sounds like the theme has been through a lot of these incidents, maybe went on a website or had mentioned one or two things, but not a lot of interaction with the community as a whole.
Yes, exactly. None of them have had. None of these shooters have. And I think that I find it unlikely that anyone who is a frequent poster or personality in the community is ever going to be a danger to people, the threat to people, because they have an identity. Some people find an identity in this. And if they're up on the website making jokes and having pals and having a megaphone in a way, that's probably not someone who's going to commit a mass shooting. These are loners usually.
Right. Well, it kind of goes back to something that you mentioned earlier, whereas the distinction between, say, a movement and a community, whereas if you're not someone who has, this is me speculating here, but if you're not someone that has explicit political goals to change the world, then you're less of a candidate to carry out a terrorist attack than someone who is, you know, maybe with Al-Qaeda or the alt-right or something along those lines.
Right. And that's what terrorism is. I mean, it's violence to instill fear in aim of a political goal, or at least to change the social contract. And I guess people could make an argument that, like Elliot Rodger was trying to do that with his attack, but I think that's a stretch personally. This is personal, the personal chaos of the attacker. That's what this is about. I don't believe that anyone in earnest thinks that they, as an incel, killing a bunch of people is going to make society change its attitude. They believe that these are hardwired preferences that women have and that it's genetic and that it'll never change. So it just doesn't really make sense to me.
How are these attackers seen in the wider incel community?
Which ones? Like
Elliot Rodgers or any of the names that you listed?
So with Elliot Rodger, I think a lot of people in the community can relate to the things that he said in his manifesto, just about feeling like it's unfair that, you know, he doesn't get enough attention and all of this stuff. It's like the type of thing that a frustrated young person could relate to on a bad day. And they make a lot of jokes about them being what they would call based, as in like that's I don't know how to even describe based, but it's a compliment. But they also make lots of jokes about them being whiny or crazy or losers or fake cells. Most of them are called fake cells, and their actions are not endorsed by the community. You know, they just kind of joke about everything. Like there's very little that's said in earnest when it comes to these things. And that when I talked to a few of them, for instance, after the shooting we just had in Texas, which just completely, I don't know, that was a really tough one for me. And they were making jokes already and it bothered me. And it's just like, stop, you know, but it doesn't mean that they're endorsing the violence. It's just kind of a disconnectedness. And when you point it out, they're like, oh yeah, sorry, no, it is really bad. But it's what they would call a cope. That's really all that it is.
Kind of my analogy to when you're describing that is when the media kind of takes a joke from a stand-up comedy show or something like that. And it's like, what is appropriate to talk about at 2:00 in the morning at a comedy show on a Saturday night doesn't sound good at all when it's in print on Monday morning. But if you don't have that context that it was a comedy show, it looks really, really bad once it hits the press.
Yeah. And I think that there's a big problem with jokes nowadays that Not all of them are good. Not all of them are to everyone's taste, but a joke is a joke. If it's not meant to be taken seriously, then that should be considered when it's being evaluated.
All right, Naama, let's take this thing home. What's the one thing you want listeners to remember from our conversation today?
Incels, there are many people who are incels, and 99.99999% of them would never do anything violent. Most of them don't really have hatred toward women or anything. Most of them are just lonely young people who are a little bit lost in their lives. And so I don't think they're to be feared. I think they're to be understood.
Interesting perspective. And how can listeners get in touch or learn more about your work?
So my podcast is called Incel. It's the only one called Incel. It's available wherever you find podcasts. And I also write for Unheard and some other places occasionally. You can find all that stuff by following me on Twitter at Naama Kates, my name, or at Incel Project. That's the podcast account. Pretty active on those.
All right, Naama, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Again, that was Naama Kates, creator of the Incel Podcast. And you can find a link. I'll be sure to include that in the description of the show. Thanks for listening to Talking Threat Intelligence. Never miss an episode of the show by subscribing on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you listen to episodes. And if you're looking for more insights on building a successful threat intelligence program, be sure to check out our resource page at lifegraphinc.com/blog. That's lifegraphinc.com/blog. And I hope you tune in next time.